I would like to introduce Walter, or he can introduce himself. If you'd like to take your mute off, Walter, and introduce yourself, please, as our guest speaker.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks to John to the north of England for giving us this platform to have a chat about hatch covers that we will see later. I am chairman of the IMCS group. We are a surveying and consultancy company, but we also have a training academy of which I am the director, and we are also involved in IMCS diagnostics, where I am the director too. I have been writing a few major reference works on hatch covers, also on ship inspections and mooring equipment for the Nautical Institute, and it's going to be a real pleasure for me to talk to you today about hatch covers. Thank you.
Many thank you, Walter, and thanks for joining us from North. Some of you, hopefully most of you, will know me by now. I'm the loss prevention executive responsible for the Greek region, which is great for me. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Senior Executive of Claims Claire McDowell today, who is based in our Piraeus office. It's excellent to have her on board to help us out. So myself and Claire are going to make a start before we hand over to Walter. We want to talk about causes and costs. We're going to go through some claims and through some claims statistics, and then Claire is going to run through some of the things that affect her in her claims handling. So steel cargo claims by number. Okay, I think these are fairly bold and shows you where the problems really lie. This is our North's claims by number and by cost, and you can see there 90% of all our steel cargo claims are for wet damage and mechanical damage, and that also accounts for 95% of the costs. Steel cargo types. Clearly, coils is the biggest problem, and probably the thing that the loss prevention department get asked about the most as well, the loading of coils in holds. 53% by number is all our steel claims for coils, hot and cold rolled, and for costs it's 61% by value. So almost certainly the biggest problem, most likely because both semi-finished and finished cargoes result in claims. Even the cold or the hot usually result in a claim, whereas things like rebars are a little bit more 50-50. We have claims ranges anything from a few $1,000s up to millions of dollars, and you can see there that the biggest sort of cost still goes into wet and mechanical damage, which is why we are having this webinar today. That includes the hatch cover section. You can also see there that the average cost of a steel preload survey is about $3,500 in comparison to well over $30,000 for those popular claims. So, causes and cures. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you what we often find does cause this damage and wet problem, and then I'm also going to flip it on its head and tell you what the other side usually blame. And in doing so, I hope that paves the way into why we're going to discuss things like preload surveys and hatch covers. Actual causes, in our experience, and in your experience no doubt as well, is the condition of the steel coil prior to loading. So preload condition. You can see those there sat in the warehouse. That was a photograph I took when I was a surveyor, and they've started taking away coils, and you can see the state of those coils there with regard to rust and some mechanical damage. And the mechanical damage can also be caused during the handling of those, again, quite often prior to loading. So they're the most common actual reasons. So nothing to do with our members, nothing to do with you as ship owners. But often we still get the claims. So when we go back to them and say, actually, we think it's preload, we think this is how it was before we even got hold of it, what gets blamed on the way back is your guys, the things that you're in charge of. So hatch covers. hatch covers are blamed. Ventilation, both the condition of the ventilation flap to allow water ingress and your ventilation procedure on passage, i.e. sweat in the holds, and dangerous stowage and securing, which they claim the master should have averted. But certainly those first two, hatch condition, and the weather tightness of those hatches and the ventilation, both for water ingress and record keeping and actual ventilation practices, are the go-to staple blame of the other side. And often, as I've said, that is often not the case. So it's about trying to get some evidence together to knock back those claims. So what helps the handlers? Well, Claire is our claims handler, so I'll ask her her opinion on what helps you, Claire, with this.
Thank you, John. I think, as John was saying, the most important is to gather detailed contemporaneous evidence, and that is done through a combination of third-party surveys, the scope of which can vary depending on the kind of product that's been loaded, how sensitive it is, and or the jurisdiction in question. Cargoes that are loaded from Japan, for example, don't tend to generate many preload issues, whereas other more problem jurisdictions like China, India, require a little bit more attention. But also there's a lot of onus on the crew to maintain good records and to regularly fill in logbooks for ventilation, for drainage, anything to do with bad weather, periods when the hatch covers are open and closed. And if anything of note occurs, it's always helpful to have a photo to back it up.
Thanks, Claire. As Claire says, the evidence here, and anybody that's attended any of our other webinars that we've had in this series, I know we had summer off, but you'll notice that evidence is the theme that runs through, and that comes directly from the claims handlers, not just something that I'm making up. So, as Claire says, the evidence from the load port is critical, as it is with so many cargoes, which is why we recommend this preload, independent preload survey to be carried out that includes checks and inspections and tests to the hatch covers. It doesn't end there, though. That's not the only evidence that we request. As you said, on passage, we have a responsibility there. We know, as I've said, that ventilation is something that comes up. We'll touch on that a bit later on. Good records, excellent records that we need to match the logbook entries for temperature and weather, etc. If you said that you're not ventilating because there's bad weather, then the logbook needs to also reflect that. As all the other side will ask for all of this when it comes to the claim. Dunnage, photographs. We cannot stress enough the importance of good quality time-stamped photographs. When it comes to it, many occasions that saved the day for us. Hatch covers, not just a test there, but beforehand, historical references to your planned maintenance always gets asked for. And when I say planned maintenance, often all we get given is a list of dates. Was the last time you had a look at a hatch cover? What I'm talking about is a properly filled in planned maintenance system. The date you did it, what did you do, what was found, who did it, how long did it take, and all of those things build up really good evidence. As Claire says, absolutely critical for the claims handler. So I'm going to pass back to Claire, who's going to talk a little bit more about the importance of this evidence and these preloads for her. Claire.
I think it's worth mentioning that the entire international group makes it a requirement for a ship owner that's carrying finished and semi-finished steel products to carry out a steel preload survey. And our survey, as most of the other clubs, is composed of two key areas. The first is checking the hatch covers, making sure they're weather tight, and we recommend using ultrasonic testing, which is more accurate than other methods of testing, but not relying on this alone. It should also be coupled with a visual inspection of the condition of the holds. And that goes towards the owner's obligation to provide a seaworthy, weather-tight ship. And the second one is a pre-shipment condition cargo survey. And this is because every single defect that's found in these cargoes, and particularly anything to do with rust, needs to be included in the mate's receipts to prevent the claim later on being raised at the discharge port. But as we've mentioned before, you may want to increase the scope of that survey beyond what the club requirement is. if you're in a difficult jurisdiction, if you're loading a very sensitive cargo like cold steel, you know, or in hot rolled coils. And that's something that every owner will need to consider carefully. We can move on to the next slide. And this is just the definition of seaworthiness. So under the Hague-Visby rules, the owner is obliged at the commencement of every voyage to satisfy due diligence requirements in respect of the ship, its equipment, its personnel, and any cargo spaces for the particular cargo it's intended to be carried. So it's not that she's just seaworthy, she also needs to be cargo worthy. And whilst you're not necessarily expected as a ship owner to be up to the latest device and or practice, you will be expected to comply with ordinary skill and experience, adopting common practices in the trade. And that extends to a preload survey, certainly, and beyond. So in our next slide, I just want to go into the issue of ventilation, which we notice has become quite topical lately. In 2007, there was an Australian court hearing that initially determined that a failure to have dehumidifiers on board rendered the vessel unseaworthy. It was overturned on appeal, but the owner was still found liable because they considered that the practices for ventilation and failure to mop the cargo tank tops meant that the corrosion inside the holes that could have been prevented was not on that occasion. Now, if that hadn't been enough, if the natural ventilation system for the vessel hadn't been enough, the question of whether she was seaworthy was left open. And it is in our experience that very often natural ventilation of bulk carriers is not always enough to prevent corrosion inside the hulls or ship sweat. So with this in mind, we would encourage to try and have a discussion with your charterers where possible. If you're loading in a warm weather zone and or you're transiting through warm weather zones where you're going to be stopping for long periods of time, you may want to consider splitting that cost and or getting the charterers to supply dehumidifiers. And if not, to obtain a non-responsibility clause from your charter, particularly in a voyage charter where you've got 2 known ports, you know the route and you know the exact cargo that's being carried, and try and defer any liability onto your charterer. And the next slide.
Just before we move on there, Claire, I agree with Claire, this is extremely topical at the moment. We've had a couple of cases where vessels have been loading steel and they've not loaded fully, so they've been sent out to anchor. And when out at anchor in the evening, they've had a problem with ship sweat. But because the voyage hasn't started yet, they've not been keeping accurate records whilst at anchor for their temperatures and dew points. And therefore they have gathered some ship sweat overnight whilst at anchor before going back in. And it was found that some forced ventilation, because there was no through draft whilst being stationary, forced ventilation was requested from the charter on those particular occasions, just to add some context to what Claire's saying. Thanks, Claire.
This next slide, probably John can go into more technical detail, but the only point I'm trying to reinforce is that it's something that needs to be given careful consideration. The crew need to know how to measure the relative humidity inside the holds and have the appropriate equipment to do so. The use of a hygrometer requires the crew to go inside the hold, so there's an additional safety consideration, and it should be considered in the owner's SMS provisions. And they shouldn't just be opening the hatch covers whenever there's good weather. They need to be considering whether they're going into warmer climates, because the introduction of warm air is what will lead to eventual ship sweat and corrosion.
Thanks, Claire. Just to back up what Claire's saying again there, you'll notice in the first point we refer to dew point readings. Obviously, the 3-degree rule is only appropriate for hygroscopic cargoes, and therefore is not an option for steel. Therefore, you have to follow the dew point rule. To accurately follow the dew point rule, the hygrometer needs to be a whirling hygrometer used inside the holds. If if you're just dangling thermometers down the hold, you're getting no airflow over those thermometers. We often ask for this when we're on the other side, and it's something that we would pick up on as an LP department. It absolutely has to have airflow over the wet and the dry bulb in that hygrometer, and use the appropriate dew point tables to calculate what the dew point in the hold and outside of the hold is, which obviously you can use a Stevenson screen for. But those absolutely need entry, and that needs to be considered very carefully. So dew point rule, non-hygroscopic cargoes with a whirling hygrometer inside the hold is the correct way to do this.
And now I go into the condition preload survey section and the importance of adequately clausing those mates receipts and bills. There will often be a lot of commercial pressure to issue clean bills because of letter of credit reasons, etc. But it's essential that the bill contains an accurate reflection of the cargo that's being loaded, not least because where it's described as being in good apparent order and condition and it is not, this will be deemed to be a fraud on a third-party receiver, and it will prevent owners from being able to bring any indemnity against the charterers, potentially affecting cover. In addition to that, as a practical point, just to mention that often in charter parties, the authority to issue bills is delegated to charterers agents. And it's often the case that a vessel sails and bills of lading are issued after. And we just want to emphasize how important it is that the master and the owners stay on top of the charterers agents, that they see a copy of what's going to be sent to cargo interests. Ideally, a bill of lading should include every remark, as often the mates receipts issued by the surveyor do. But sometimes charterers say that the form doesn't allow for the detail to go in, and they merely have a reference to the survey report or the mates receipts. If that is the case, it's important that the attachment with the bill has the survey report and the mates receipt behind it as a single document, and that we can see some evidence that this has been passed on to the cargo interests. And next slide. And just to mention, every single remark needs to be included, however minor it may seem. Some minor wetting and or rusting at a load port after a long voyage, particularly of course by seawater, can lead to some significant corrosion and big claims at the discharge port. And it also needs to be as specific as possible. General remarks don't often assist an owner in defending a claim. You ideally want to identify how many pieces of cargo or packaging have been affected and link these to the identification tags if possible. We strongly recommend that you try and avoid loading wet steel, but if the master crew are faced with this situation, please get in touch with us and we can liaise with the local people on the ground and the correspondents and the surveyors to see how that situation can be managed. If it needs to be loaded, it needs to be stored separately, and appropriate remarks need to be included in the bills, such as wet before loading, loaded in rain, etc. And this slide, really all I want to say is that the IG is conscious that these surveys are carried around everywhere in the world, and some of these surveyors, English is not their first language, so the terminology that's used for the clausing may vary, and there is specific recommended wording by the IG. I've listed some of those examples of how that rust should be described, ideally a percentage of the rust on the surface area of the cargo, how any physical mechanical damage should be described. And in order to avoid misinterpretations, it's always helpful if the surveyor also backs it up with a number of photographs in the survey report, and it avoids room for argument later on. And John has attached a photo of our loss prevention guide, which goes into this in some further detail. John, do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, that particular book has all 28 recommended clauses with photographic examples in it, and all our members can get that for free. If you ask me, I can get you a hard copy, but you can also, through My North, go online and get the PDF copy of that to send out to the vessels as well.
And in terms of the allocation of risk and any indemnity against your charterer, seaworthiness issues will stay with the owner, but cargo operations can be allocated to either party. And this is despite the standard position under the Hague-Fisby rules, which is that in the absence of any provision, the owner is responsible for all operations, including loading, stowage, damaging, etc. But the Jordan II stipulated that it can be contractually deviated from. And so it is often the case that charterers are responsible for loading. This is a standard provision in clause 8 of the NYP without amendments, provided it doesn't say under the supervision and responsibility of the master. And so it is really a contractual issue, and it's not a matter of who pays or who appoints the stevedores. So to bear that in mind. In the next clause, just whilst the charterers may be responsible for loading the cargo, there's obviously an interest, the owner will be interested in seeing that it's done properly and that no damage is caused to the ship, and or that there's no risks of unseaworthiness going with it. What the case law has suggested is that when a charterer has loaded so badly so as to render the vessel unseaworthy, they will still be responsible for that cargo claim, unless the effective cause is something that's within the master's province, for example, incorrectly performed stability calculations. And so in the next slide, I explain that it's a tricky balance between carefully supervising how the loading operation and stowage is being conducted on board, but not interfering with that operation and potentially assuming responsibility. So what we would suggest is that where master and owners become concerned about the way that the cargo is being loaded or stowed, they are entitled to stop loading operations. They can get in touch with us, and we get in touch with the surveyors, who we always instruct not to interfere or direct ships on how to do it, but we can reject the method in which it's been doing and ask them to resubmit a new stowage plan or new proposed method of loading that is more suitable for the cargo that's being put on board.
Yeah, I think just to jump in there again, Claire, I think one of the key things you said there was that the master and the crew still need to monitor the cargo. We do see some cases where when the charterer is responsible and there is an appointed surveyor, that the master and crew do tend to relax a little bit and maybe not monitor things quite as they should. The surveyor is there to help and assist, certainly, yes, but they still need to monitor to recognise these situations where they might be concerned. Thanks, Claire.
And this is the last bit from me, and that is when the claim does materialise, then, like we were saying, we will need all the evidence, ideally, of what happened with the cargo before it arrived at the port, how it was stored at the port, how it was loaded, and what happens after it's discharged. And obviously, the more times that it undergoes cargo handling operations, then the higher the risk of damage occurring in the process. And you will want to consider what method of transport was used, whether it's open trucks where it can be exposed to rain spray, is it carried in barges, may it have come in contact with the sea spray, was it stored in the open, was there dunnage on the floor of where it was being stored to prevent it coming in contact with any moisture that might have been there. We should try and secure the charter party terms that are incorporated in the bills. It's not always the head charter, it may be a sub-charter party. Consider limitation. Some jurisdictions like the US are quite problematic because standard GENCON bills of lading are deemed to not provide the owner with sufficient opportunity to state the value of the cargo, and therefore there's no limitation available. And then we will look at mitigation issues. What's the available salvage market? What are the reprocessing costs, etc. And thank you very much. And I think now it's back to John. John, we don't hear you.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, just want to reiterate there before I hand over to Walter that we will arrange the preload survey for you, and depending on the terms that you're entered with those, cover some of the costs for that as well. They will do things like check the steel preload, steel condition before load, use silver nitrate to check that over, hold condition, and things like, and the preload condition, hatches, hatch visual inspection. They aren't really there to do tallies, watch the loading itself, and watch the use of mechanical means to move the steel whilst on board. However, we strongly recommend that you consider that in a way of helping gather that absolutely critical evidence that we need in the event of a claim. So I'm going to hand over to the main event, which is Walter. Just bear with us while we change over presentations. We did have some technical difficulties yesterday whilst practicing this, but hopefully they will not rear their heads today. Okay, Walter.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see. You need to make it big.
Okay, we go in the presentation mode. There we are. That is okay for everyone?
I can see it. Claire, can you confirm?
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. Thanks, Walter.
Perfect. So, yes, good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure today to talk to you about hatch covers and about a few critical items that have to be observed when we are talking about hatch covers. And I was thinking on how we can actually start with this presentation within the scope of steel claims and so on. So I thought let us go back basically to the real basics and to the business model in shipping. And that is actually transporting cargo and delivering the cargo in time, in good condition, in a safe and in an environmental friendly way. And that requires, of course, a seaworthy ship. Now, if we look to seaworthiness, we can actually see that seaworthiness is divided or comprises three critical items. That's the technical part, the cargo part, and the voyage part. And from a technical point of view, we are looking to the hull, the structure, the engine, equipment, certificates. Whereas from the cargo part, we are looking to things which may actually affect the condition of the cargo, such as hatch covers, ventilation, hull cleanliness, cooling, bilge, ballast systems. Things which, when we talk about steel, are causing wetting damage, as John already pointed out earlier. And then we have the voyage pillar, which includes the crew, fuel, water provision, but also supplies and spare parts that may be necessary to complete the voyage in a proper way. Now, what do we see? That most of the claims that are generated are actually caused by that second pillar, or they fall under that second pillar of cargo worthiness. And if we look to that business model, in case that you have a damage, you will see that there are quite a lot of commercial related issues that are popping up. We get loss of output, delays, storage issues, loss of cargo, of course, separating of the damaged cargo, which is time consuming and very expensive, reconditioning works for the cargo, legal costs, unsatisfied customers, company image. And we have, of course, also the P&I cover, which may come under pressure, and scheduled repairs that may be required before the vessel can set sail again. But apart from the commercial related issues, we should also not lose sight of the legal related issues. If the vessel stays in port for a prolonged time, well, okay, at that moment, port state control may actually become suspicious and come on board to have a look, and that can only aggravate the situation, perhaps. And then, of course, there is also something that we should not forget. Hatch covers, they should be tight, they should not leak, and if they leak, that can mean an infringement of one or even more statutory rules or requirements. Now, when we are again looking to that business model, you have to ask yourself, okay, what do we want to do? Do we want to sail or do we want to trade? If you sail, you are just spending money. That is what you do with a yacht, but not with a commercial vessel. But if you want to trade, you want to make money, and you do that by transporting cargo or even passengers. Now, within that point of view, what do you think we will need? Do we actually need a technical seaworthy ship, or do we need a cargo-worthy ship? Knowing that most of the claims are actually being generated by that second pillar, which is the cargo-related items. Now, what do we see in real life? We see that people who want to transport cargo on board of a ship, they want to have that cargo insured, and the cargo underwriters, the cargo insurance, they will generally require the shippers to present proof that the vessel which will be carrying their cargo is classed by an IACS class member, that class and statutory certificates are all right, and that the port state control history of the vessel is quite satisfactory, which means that the vessel complies with statutory instruments and that there are no significant infringements against statutory requirements. On top of that, most insurance companies will require that the ship is covered for P&I risks with an international P&I club, and that the ship is 25 years of age, even if that may not always be relevant. However, if we see this, then we will see that actually IACS class and port state control records or history are actually referring to the technical seaworthiness, and that is actually the basic minimum standard. I mean, that allows the ship to sail from A to B, but not necessarily to trade the intended cargo. So if we know that vessels are being fixed by looking to the seaworthy technical standards, and that we know that claims are generated by cargo-related issues, cargo worthiness items, and if we know that the technical standards in the cargo worthiness standards are different, then we know that there is a certain risk, because we are actually fixing a vessel on the wrong standards. And on top of that, when we talk about steel cargo, we know that steel and seawater are not very good friends. That generally results in claims, which in itself is a risk too. So let us now look to key shipboard equipment for the steel trade business model. So the equipment that you would expect to be all right when you want to have a cargo-worthy vessel. And in the first place, we see that these are the hatch covers, followed by the bilges, the ballast tanks, and of course, let's say the condition of the hold preparation operations, freshwater washing, and so on. And ventilation can also be completing this list. Now, what we as IMCS have been doing is that over the last 10 years, we have developed the ArcelorMittal vetting program, which is a program that focuses on the suitability of a vessel for trading steel cargo. And from, let's say, the last 3.5 to 4 years, I have actually made a few statistics, which I will show in a minute. But we are looking here to a total of 1,589 cargo surveys or cargo worthiness surveys over a 3.5 year period, with 1,440 ships being inspected by a surveyor team that was especially trained for this type of surveys. So that makes that the statistics that we obtain from these inspections being compiled by people with the same background, knowledge and training are very reliable. Now, what do we see? We look to the hatch covers where we make an ultrasonic test as well as a visual inspection of the hatch covers. We check the bilges for suction, we check them for backflow, and we carry out a visual inspection of the bilge well and the bilge system. We also check the ballast tanks, and we do that by making a pressure test. So that is going to test the tanks, the vents, the vent pipes and the sounding pipes. And we're going to see if the hold is ready to receive the cargo. That means has the hold been properly prepared. I mean, seawater washing, then freshwater rinsing, and a silver nitrate test that is carried out to spot any specific areas where cleaning may not have been sufficient to for receiving steel cargo. Now you will see here two pies actually. And those inspection pies, they reflect on the left the initial rating after the inspections were carried out. What does that mean? I mean, we go on board, we make the full inspection, which is actually a very dedicated, a very structured and a very strict inspection program that is not taking too much time, roughly about 3 to 4 hours maximum, depending a little bit on the size of the vessel. And after that inspection is finished, we get, of course, an overview of all the problems that were found. Now, if we look to that initial inspection and the results after an initial inspection, we can see that 8% of the ships are good over all the line. All cargo worthiness items are as they should be according to the book. We see that 38% are showing minor, smaller problems, which are, let's say, relatively easy to be rectified by the ship staff. 46% have problems which are serious, which cannot be dealt with by the ship staff just in a couple of minutes, as a matter of speaking. No, they will actually require specialist assistance. And finally, we have 8% of the ships which are totally unacceptable. We are talking here about holes, we are talking about cracks, corroded pipes, all that type of things, hatch covers which are deformed, which are heavily leaking, and so on. Now, with this inspection, I mean, we have adopted an owner-friendly approach, meaning that we are going to help to put the owner on track in order to improve the condition of his vessel. We do that through a very structured system of feedback so that the owner knows what we are looking for, what type of evidence we expect in order to re-evaluate the situation and to see if the condition of the vessel cannot be upgraded. And that happens, and that is done in very good understanding together with the ship owner. And after such a feedback process, which can sometimes take 1 or 2, let's say, not interventions from an inspection point of view, but exchange of information, we will see that it is possible to upgrade the vessel's condition so that we get, let's say, a rating or an inspection pie where 23% of the ships are okay, where 37 are showing minor problems, 32% still have serious issues, and 8% are unacceptable. Now, that actually makes that from a 46% of ships which are good or with minor defects, we go to 60%, which on a database of 2,000 vessels means 15% or roughly something like 300 vessels more than the initial rating after the initial inspection. And what we have seen, and that was the policy that was implemented by the top management of ArcelorMittal, is that they said, well, okay, we go for trouble-free trading. We are only going to accept green or yellow rated vessels for fixtures. What have we seen over a period, let's say over the last 5 years, that the claims have been decreasing spectacularly. We are coming down from quite significant claim rates up to close to 0 claims and complaints. Now that is of course good for ArcelorMittal, but that is also good for the ship owner. So if we look to this situation where we see that quite a significant portion of ships appears to be having serious problems, which do not allow fixtures and which may cause serious problems, we see that roughly 54 initially or 40% after feedback have still serious problems. Now, all these ships were technically seaworthy. They had class and statutory certificates that were perfectly okay, valid, and in order. 94% of the ships were Ajax classed. And the question that we can ask ourselves, okay, but were these ships, are they cargo worthy? What about validity of notices of readiness? What about enhanced risk and exposure to claims? And as you can see, I mean, a few of those slides already illustrate the type of problems that we find on those vessels. You can see serious backflow issues from the bilges, strong reaction to silver nitrate test, punctured tanks, leaking hatch covers. So, I mean, if we see this situation, and in case you should have a claim, how will it be possible for a P&I club to defend your interest, to prove that you have been diligent? And of course, what will it do to your business model? Well, in case of a claim, your business model will be scuttled. So apart from that business model related issue, don't forget, as I said before, leaking hatch covers have also an effect on legal or statutory issues. Think about load line, think about SOLAS, MARPOL, document of compliance in case of IMDG cargo that can be dangerous when wet. Think about exemption of firefighting. Exemption for your CO2 system requires tight hatch covers. Think about fumigation, the carriage of pesticides under SOLAS. If your hatch covers leak fumigant, people can die. And also, the cargo will not be properly fumigated, resulting in a claim. Not steel, but perhaps on some edible cargoes and products and cereals. Think about, let's say, the softer issues like the Code of Safe Working Practice. Think about MLC, which requires also safety issues, training issues for the crew working with hatch covers and so on. So a lot of legal items are actually not to be overlooked neither. And let us go to ISM, which is SOLAS Chapter 9, but I mean, looked to as a little bit as an independent issue. What about your safety management system? I mean, we know that the threefold mantra of ISM is safety, environment, and avoiding damage to third-party property. What you see here on these photographs is pollution caused by leaking cylinders of hatch covers, wetting damage to cargo, and accidents and injuries, which sometimes may be fatal. Then we come, actually, when we look to steel cargo and claims, the main type of cargoes that sustain wetting damage and resulting claims are steel. That is what you could already see on the slides presented by John earlier in this webinar. And the predominant cause is leaking hatch covers. And if hatch covers leak when you are loading steel, okay, the steel cargo will become damaged. But don't forget that the next voyage, when you are loading another type of cargo, that cargo may also be at risk. And we are seeing a similar situation for many years. It's a persistent problem. So you can yourself ask, okay, why? Why do we have this type of problem? Why is it persistent? I mean, is it perhaps something that is related to steel hatch covers? Well, okay, I mean, perhaps we can say that from the moment single pull hatch covers came on the market, let's say in the early 60s, late 50s, and so on, and when they became really commonplace by the 70s, and then as from there on, most of the ships would have steel hatch covers and not the tarpaulin ones. Well, okay, what can we then say? That with steel hatch covers, we are seeing continuous problems with leakage. Then, of course, that's resulting in cargo claims. And it seems to be impossible to eradicate this. In the meantime, in that same period, we have been flying to the moon, we have invented internet, but still hatch cover issues, they remain. So why is that? Because we see, of course, that when we talk about steel claims, steel and seawater are not a good match. But we also see that there is little understanding of how hatch covers work. And there is that wrong perception that hatch covers are heavy and strong pieces of equipment, so they can be bullied and they are not so delicate and not much attention is needed. And actually, the contrary is true. We often see incomplete and confusing hatch cover inspection reports, which leads to wrong conclusions. In many cases, we will see that if cargo became wet damaged, it will be written that the main cause was the rubber packing, which was in a poor condition. However, that is not the root cause. The rubber packing is a symptom. It's showing that something is wrong, but that something that is wrong may well be bearing pads, locators, stoppers, compression bars. So the root cause needs to be identified and tackled in a proper way. And then we have improper inspections and tests. I mean, you can make a test, but if it is not properly done, well, it's of not much use neither. And we also see to improper maintenance and repairs. Very often, just in order to start loading as quickly as possible, quicksy-fixy repairs are done to the packing rubber, to the panels, and all with a view to passing perhaps an ultrasonic test carried out by the shippers, but in the end you remain with a very poor repair, which will not qualify as due diligence. We also see deeply embedded poor practices, excessive tightening of cleats, hoping that it will make hatch covers tighter, which it does not. And also putting Vaseline on the packing rubber, just to keep it flexible, which is actually nonsense. So that is so deeply embedded that we see this time and again. In other cases, people may think that, well, okay, the shippers have carried out a US test and they didn't hear anything, so everything is all right, and we can start loading. By doing so, they ignore the importance of a visual inspection, which is also required. So we do see that there are many problems, and of course, when we have problems, when we have claims, loss prevention comes into the game, and we are going to set up hatch cover surveys. And during those surveys, we are looking to compliance with load line, which would be a little bit the technical part of the seaworthiness, but we're going to test the hatch covers for tightness, and we're going to make a visual inspection to ensure that everything with the hatch covers is there in good condition and will help us in maintaining tightness once the ship is at sea. When we look to load line compliance, we are actually looking to strength issues, tightness issues, and securing issues. And that tightness is important mostly when we are at sea, not in the port. And when we make an ultrasonic test, we are going to look to the sealing arrangements and more specifically to the compression that we have in the packing rubber. And the visual inspection is going to look to the key parts, which will help to maintain that degree of compression in the packing rubber. So if we focus for a moment on the load line convention, we will see that the load line convention is there to protect the ship and the crew. The cargo is of secondary importance under load line because that is money that can be replaced. People not. So when we look to the load line, we are generally looking with a seafaring background to say, well, okay, how much have we loaded? However, with the load line convention, it's the other way around. Not what is underwater is important, it is what is above the water that is important. That is what we call the freeboard. Freeboard means extra buoyancy, means extra safety for the ship and the crew. So when we are talking about hatch covers under load line, these are big openings, which if they fail can allow a lot of water to get into the hold. And if that happens, the load line, which clearly says that the load line will never be submerged at any stage of the voyage, I mean, we will see that on a perfectly loaded ship, loaded to the marks, if the hatch covers leak, we are adding weight to the ship. That means that the load line will become submerged if the weather or if the water infiltration continues, which will reduce the freeboard and in the worst case may even lead to sinking of the ship. Now, when we see to the load line convention, the load line convention talks about weather tightness. And weather tightness means that in any sea condition, water will not penetrate into the ship. Now, when I am talking to people, I try to make it a little bit more clear as to what weather tightness means. Because weather tight is a word that you will not find in the dictionary. It's typical lingo for the maritime industry. And it actually means that the water that should not penetrate into the ship should come from the weather side. That means where the weather is. That can be hurricanes, freak waves, heavy weather, green seas, sprays, rain, hail, snow, whatever may cause water to infiltrate into the ship should not get into the holds. Now, when we talk about water ingress, which is a risk, because I just explained that if water is coming into the hold, then it's adding weight to the ship, submerging the load line, and so the ship may be at risk. So we are talking here about water ingress as a serious risk for safety and also for the cargo, of course. Now, when we know that there is a risk, especially nowadays, we tend to manage the risk. We try to reduce the risk, and some people are taking a specific approach to that. They manage load line issues, as you can see on the photograph. But what we have to do is to reduce the risk up to an acceptable level. And when we talk about the risk, we will try to keep the water out in any sea condition. And that is not easy. That is a real challenge, to keep water out, to prevent it from infiltrating into the hold via the hatch covers is absolutely a difficult thing. But most people will say, well, we do have the packing rubbers, don't we? But you have to understand that you cannot keep water out with the packing rubber alone. What is important is to understand that if we want to reduce the risk for water ingress, we will have to work with safety barriers. And in or with hatch covers, we're going to talk about 3 safety barriers which will efficiently keep water out of the hold in such a way that the ship will never be at risk of sinking. And those 3 safety barriers are actually, in the first place, the steel construction of the hatch cover, the steel plating, that is keeping out 99% of the water. It's only where water can infiltrate in between the interpanel void spaces or around the perimeter of the hatch, that is where we will have the rubber packing and where compression of the packing rubber is needed in order to compensate for the relative movement between the panels or between the panels and the ship. But in case the design of the packing rubber is such that it will keep out water for normal and even extreme heavy weather, there will be situations that the design compression of the packing rubber may not be sufficient for keeping the water out. That can be, for instance, a situation where we have extreme heavy weather for a long period, or where we can have hurricanes. At that moment, the ship's movements and the relative movements can be so much that they could not be calculated in the design stage, and that at a certain moment, only and only when you have these extreme conditions, water may infiltrate through the packing rubber and the compression bar interface, and in order to comply with load line requirements, it should not fall into the hold. It's falling in our 3rd safety barrier, which is the drain channel. Of course, in extreme heavy weather, when the ship is moving and rolling and pitching like hell, it is possible that some of the water from that drain channel may splash over the edge of the drain channel and fall on the cargo underneath. That will cause damage to the cargo, but the ship will never be in danger. And that is basically where the cargo underwriters will come into the game. If we can prove through due diligence that we have done everything to avoid water ingress, and that means that the hatch covers, amongst other things, are in good condition, and we see that type of damage pattern on top of the cargo with leakage traces and streaks on the cargo, then the cargo underwriters will foot the bill, because this is what we call force majeure, act of God, something that is beyond the control of the ship owner and the captain. And in that case, the costs and the claim will be borne by the cargo underwriters. However, if the hatch covers would not be properly maintained, then the legal situation for settling the claim will be totally different, and we often see that the ship owner and the ship are then blamed for not being diligent. So we have three safety barriers: the panels, the rubber packing with a specific design compression on the rubber seal, and the drain channel. Now, you already heard me talking about relative movements. Now, why do we have relative movements? That is because the ship is a little bit like a box of cookies. As long as the lid is on, that box is quite rigid. But when we remove the lid, then you can twist the box very easily. It has lost its rigidity. And that is exactly what we do when we build a ship. The ship is more or less like a box, and in the cover lid, the deck plating, we're going to cut huge holes to load the cookies or cargo inside. Now, by doing so, we are weakening the structure of the vessel, which will be compensated with other parts. But I mean, we're making the ship weaker, and that causes and allows the ship to twist and to warp and to cause deformations, which will have an effect later on the hatch covers and tightness. So we know that the ship is flexible, and that is already the first thing that will make the ship move, twist and bend. Secondly, operational conditions like hogging and sagging, or draft changes, hydrostatic pressure that is increasing, or heavy weather or ice pressure on the shell plating also cause deformations on the hatch cover on the ship and on the hatch cover ceiling, actually. Now, what do we know? When we talk about hatch covers, we know that hatch covers have to be strong and rigid. If hatch covers would be twisting and be flexible, it would be impossible to close the hatch covers or to open them without them derailing from the track. And if they would be flexible and weak and so on, I mean, at that moment, it would be impossible to load cargo on top of the hatch covers, which with steel hatch covers is common practice. So now we know that we have a flexible ship and we have stiff and strong hatch covers. So what is the logic result? The hatch covers will not be moving in unison with the ship. They will be subject to relative movements, and that will be between the panels themselves, but also between the panels and the coaming. So we have that relative movement between the panels and the coaming, and those movements will be in the longitudinal, transversal, and the vertical direction, which is referred to in many manuals as Fx, Fy, and Fz. And in order to keep those relative movements to a limit, or to limit those relative movements, we're going to work with pieces with key parts like bearing pads, stoppers, and locators, so that little movement is allowed, but we're going to control those movements so that they do not become excessive. Now, we know that there is a need for packing rubbers to compensate for the relative movements between the panels and the coaming. And in order to compensate for those movements, that rubber packing needs to have a design compression, which is expressed in millimeters. And this is the first stage where we talk about millimeters. We're talking about hatch covers, which may be 30 meters long, 15 meters wide, which may weigh 100 tons or even more, but we are talking about millimeters. And that makes it clear how delicate hatch covers are actually in reality. And when we have sufficient compression on the packing rubber will be continuously compensating for the relative movements. That means it will become compressed and relaxed, and that pumping motion will continue throughout the whole voyage, throughout the whole, let's say, the full in-service life of the packing rubber, which, when well maintained, can attain 5 years or even 7 years of age without any problem. And that compensation or that compensating activity is necessary because when the packing rubber is compressed, I mean, then we have a certain compression range, and even if there is a relative movement, the surface of the packing rubber will always remain in contact with the compression bar, and that will actually give us a tight seal. Now, as you can see here, and as I said, design compression is a matter of millimeters. And you can see that on the screen, on the photograph here, we have a 90 by 50 packing rubber, which will be, by design, calculated, be compressed up to 13 millimeters. Now, that compression is very important, as you already know. And when we know, and when there would be a possibility to establish that we have a good compression when we are in port, then we know that thanks to that good compression, our packing rubber will be able to pump and to compensate when the ship is at sea, and therefore there will always be a line of contact between the rubber and the compression bar, and that is going to prevent water from entering in the ship's hold. Now, I talked already about the design compression, which in this case is 13 millimeter. In case of a rubber, for the other example of 70 by 40, we will see that as a rule of thumb, the design compression is roughly 20% of the nominal thickness of the packing rubber. So 25% of 40 millimeter is 10 millimeter. That will be the design compression, roughly. Look to the slide on the left or the photograph on the left. We have 50 millimeter and 30 millimeter is the design compression. So that's also approximately 25%. Now we see here that the discard criteria to, let's say, to repair or to replace the packing rubber is generally set to 50% of the design compression. So that would mean that if I have 5 millimeter of permanent set in my packing rubber, which is designed for a design compression of 10 millimeter, I have to renew it. So you see that we are talking even about less millimeters now. And that has all to do with that compensating capacity of the rubber, which is induced in the packing rubber thanks to the design compression. So in a schematic way, you can see that on the left, the packing rubber is lightly touching the compression bar. And when we are making an ultrasonic test, we will see how ultrasonic testing allows actually to check compression. And on the left drawing, you will see that the packing rubber is gently resting on the compression bar. And you will see those triangular spaces, which is actually roughness, unevenness of the packing rubber, that will still allow air-laden or ultrasound-laden air to pass through the packing rubber compression bar interface. Typically, that would give you a readout that is about 50% of an open hatch reading. Now, if we are going to compress the packing rubber more and more, you will see that as we come to the right of the screen, the more pressure that we have, the less ultrasound-laden air will be able to pass through the packing rubber and the compression bar, and it becomes less and less and less until there will be a moment that you will not hear anything anymore. If that stage is achieved, you will have proof that you have sufficient compression on the packing rubber. That means that there will be sufficient flexibility in the packing rubber to compensate for relative movements once the ship will be at sea. When we would take a reading on our ultrasonic equipment gear at that moment, we will see that we would have very low negative readings, which indicate that we have a good degree of compression and that actually our packing rubber compression is all right. Now, we are interested in knowing that the packing rubber will perform well once the ship is at sea. What can we do with ultrasound? We can check the compression, and as we now know, we know that if we have sufficient compression on the packing seal when the ship is in port, we know that the packing seal will be working well once the ship is at sea. And that is, of course, allowing us to make sort of a prediction that once we know that the results of our ultrasonic test are okay, then we know that the ship and the cargo will be safe when the ship is at sea. However, not only ultrasound, as we will see in a minute, is important, we will also need to make a visual inspection, because as I pointed out earlier, many people start loading because they don't hear anything during an ultrasonic test prior to loading, and they automatically assume that because an ultrasonic test, which is in their opinion difficult to pass, if that test is being passed, then of course your hatch covers must be in good condition. They overlook the fact that with ultrasound we are only checking the packing rubber in the compression bar seal or interface. Now, in order to give you a better understanding of how ultrasonic testing works, we are working with a transmitter and a receiver. And in the transmitter we have sensors, but also in the receiver we have sensors. And we are working with piezoelectrical crystals, which have that characteristic that if you squeeze them, they discharge an electrical current. When we charge them with an electrical current, they start to vibrate. Now, everything that vibrates, that has a turbulent flow, or that causes impact, has an ultrasonic signature. So if we cause vibration of a piezoelectrical crystal, that is going to create turbulence around the crystal, around the sensor, around the transmitter, and that's going to have a typical ultrasonic signature. Now, when we are switching on our transmitter, the hold will be filled with ultrasound, and it will be a little bit like water in a boiling kettle. It cannot penetrate anywhere, so it stays captured in the hold. The ultrasound pressure, the sound pressure will increase, and at the moment that there is a leak or a crack or an imperfection or a discontinuity in the packing rubber, then ultrasound will be forced out through that problem or through that defect, and on deck I will be standing with my receiver, which also has a piezoelectrical crystal based sensor, and the ultrasounds which are escaping, they are going to hit the sensor of my receiver. Now, sound is a pressure wave, so I'm going to have an impact on my piezoelectrical crystal in the receiver. That crystal will become compressed, and that is going to discharge an electrical current. By doing so, I am actually able to measure the intensity of an ultrasonic leak. And the problem is that it's ultrasound, so I cannot hear it with the human ear, but I can measure it by using, let's say, an in-between, which is the piezoelectrical crystal, which discharges an electrical current. So by measuring an electrical current, I can actually measure the importance of a leak in the packing rubber. That is why we talk about ultrasound leaks in decibel microvolt. We are expressing actually a leak, the intensity of a leak in microvolts. So if now we have a big leak, then you will see that a lot of ultrasounds will be impacting on the sensor, and that's going to cause a significant squeezing of the crystal and a significant discharge of electrical current. It gives me a high reading, and I know I have a big leakage in that area or in that spot. On the other hand, if I have a smaller leak, then there will only be a gentle impact and a low reading, and I know that the leak may not be so important. Now, in ultrasonic testing, we do appreciate that hatch covers are not new. They tend to become used in, let's say, in time and during the in-service life. So we give a certain allowance and we say, well, we do allow signals of 10% of an open hatch value to, let's say, to be there, because we do not really require absolute tightness. So we're going to go for, we will be a little bit lenient, and we're going to say, well, 10% of an open hatch value, that is acceptable. Whatever is below is good. Whatever is above is becoming a problem. Now, why is ultrasonic testing so interesting? And I'm not telling that because I have actually been pioneering it 30 years ago, but it is over time, it has proven to be a very useful tool for checking the weathertight integrity of hatch covers and to test compression on packing rubbers. And we can see that it is easy and quick, that there is no pollution risk, pinpoint accuracy. We can, on the millimeter close, we can indicate where we have a problem. The cargo holds can be loaded or empty. There are no temperature restrictions. It can be done by one person, and it is not expensive, especially not when you compare it to a cargo plane. The benefits for the industry, the benefits for the owner and for the crew is that it can be done quickly. You don't need water on deck. There is no pollution risk of washing grease or oil or whatever over the side. It's quick, so we can easily find back the fault. If we can identify problems in an early stage, it's easier to repair them. We can do, even if the ship would already be partly loaded and we would like to check that everything is okay, can still be done. Whether it is in the Gulf or whether it is in Arctic areas, I mean, doesn't matter. You can always do it. And host test, of course, is restricted due to temperatures and sub-zero temperatures. And we can only, we can do it actually alone, but I always recommend that there is someone there for safety purposes, of course, assisting the surveyor. And finally, it's cheap, but we can also find back the compression. And now exactly that compression that we can find back is what allows us to predict if packing rubber will be working well when the ship is at sea. Now, ultrasonic testing or ultrasound testing is a great technique and a great tool, but it needs to be used by experienced operators. And the results of the test have to be correctly evaluated, because otherwise you get wrong results and wrong conclusions. Now, that is also a challenge. And I will give you a few examples. When we see here the test report with a lot of red stars and stripes, which indicate leak sites, at that moment, I think it is clear for everyone that these hatch covers have a serious problem and that they are going to leak and that the cargo will not be safe. Now, let us look to a second scenario. And that is a scenario where no sound has been recorded. So nothing has been heard during the test, and the test report is clean. The question here is, are those hatch covers weathertight? Well, to be honest, I cannot tell. Because it may well be that no sound was passing through, but why was there no sound passing through? Of course, the fact that I didn't hear anything is very encouraging, but it may be that there are specific defects to the hatch covers or to the packing rubber or to the compression bar, or perhaps some fiddling of the crew by putting excessive grease or sealants or anything like that, which are blocking the ultrasound. And of course, on the receiving side, I will hear nothing. So can I say that this hatch is ready for loading? No. I need further investigation. And another situation would be where, and that is perhaps a very frequently or the most frequently seen situation, where we have a few spot leaks and a very small linear leak. Now, that hatch is not ideal But is this going to cause a major problem? In my honest opinion, not. We will not see the claim of the century because we have 2 or 3 spot leaks in scattered areas. Because if our third safety barrier, the drain channel, is working well, the minute quantities of water that may penetrate will be drained off, and the claim will generally not be sky high or significant. The only problem is that when we make a test and we find those leaks, we will report that back to the captain, basically a representative of the ship owner. We will give that to the captain and say, listen, captain, we have finished the test. You have now a number of leaks, and that is our conclusion. Okay, the captain, when he receives that news and when he wants to exercise due diligence, he should now go over to action and repair the reason for those leaks. Usually, if you have small leaks, those small leaks are quite easy to repair and can be done relatively easily by the ship's crew. And therefore, by the time that loading is finished, the ship should be able to go out, to go to sea without any problem. However, if the captain decides not to do anything about this, then if something would happen and a claim would be filed against the ship, he will be in a very difficult position to prove that he exercised due diligence, because there is proof that something was wrong and he decided for commercial or time reasons or whatever not to do anything about it, and that is of course not a very diligent attitude. So another story that is frequently heard is that when the ship goes to the terminal or to a port for loading, and that they know that before loading the shippers will be carrying out an ultrasonic test or the P&I clock, at that moment the ship staff may already say, well, we're not going to take a risk, we are going to carry out a hose test. And the ship's crew will go with hoses on deck, they will carry out a hose test, and in the hold no water is found, which means that the cargo hold remains dry, and that is for many people the basis to conclude that the hatch covers are okay. Then the ship arrives in port, everyone is confident that further testing will be satisfactory, but what do we see? The ultrasound test fails. The ship's crew has, or the hatch covers are leaking ultrasonically in several areas. Is that possible? Yes, that is possible because when the crew was making a hose test, they were actually checking if all around and in the cross joints there was contact between the packing rubber and the compression bar, which was going to preclude water entry. However, you do not know how much compression there was on the packing seal, and that is exactly what we can do with ultrasound. So the surveyor coming on board with ultrasonic testing gear, he is going to check not if there was contact, which, as I pointed out, would be roughly 50% of the open hatch value, and which would preclude water to pass. He's going to make a test against the 10% fail pass criteria that is there for ultrasonic testing and for establishing compression in the packing seal. So actually, on the sketch again, the drawing or the sketch most on the left is indicating a stage where you may carry out a hose test, where no water will pass because the molecules of water are bigger than the ones of air and ultrasound, and at that moment water is not going to pass, but ultrasound will still pass. Now, if we go to the rightmost sketch, there no ultrasound will pass, the hatch covers will be okay, we will get low readings, and we know that whatever is below the 10% is acceptable. That means that a fair degree of compression is left. It may not be 100% full compression, but still sufficient compression to preclude water entry and to allow compensation of the relative movements. So we here make very clear that contact is not the same as compression. And with ultrasound, in a very quick and in an efficient manner, we can get an idea of the compression. From research and development, I know that what type of degree of compression and so on you can expect, but basically what is not possible to say as a standard rule is that with a reading of so much decibel microvolt, you have a compression of 4 millimeter, because that depends from a wide or a different big and a different number of parameters. Depends from the age, the type of rubber, and so on. And you cannot map that because there are too many types of rubber, too many types of compression bar, and of course, too many ways that packing rubber can be aged, affected, abraded, and so on. But if we get an ultrasonic test that is encouraging and which gives us good readings indicating that there is compression, then we can assume that the packing rubber will be okay. And experience has learned us that this is indeed the fact. A claim with a major, let's say, a trial run over 3 years with a major fertilizer manufacturer revealed that prior to making ultrasonic tests of the hatch covers, or prior to the manufacturer starting with making ultrasonic tests of the hatch covers, they actually had a claim and a complaint ratio of 75% of the shipments. Once they started to apply ultrasonic testing, after 3 years, that was reduced to 0.6. So definitely ultrasonic testing, when it is carried out in a proper way, is a top tool and technique for checking your packing rubbers. However, I already told you that with ultrasound, we check the compression of the packing rubber. And when we look to the load line convention, that tells us that tightness is very important, but that the strength of the panels and the contrivances on the hatch covers and the securing of the hatch cover panels is also equally important. Now, that is something that we cannot check with ultrasound. To do that, we need a visual inspection. So if I know that my hatch covers or my packing rubbers have a good compression, according to the test results, let us now confirm that the good readings that I have are indeed coming from packing rubbers which are in a perfect or in a good condition. And let us also look to all the other parts which are helping to maintain that good compression on the packing rubber when the ship will be at sea, because that is where tightness is needed. And in order to give you a good idea and perhaps something that you can take with you in your shipboard routines, I have already listed 9 key parts which are actually very important in maintaining the tightness on the panels, but also which prevent failure of the hatch covers because of faulty securing or corrosion, cracks, strength issues with the panel and the hatch cover structure in general. So you can see those key parts: panels, bearing pads, locators and stoppers, the rubber compression bars, securing mechanisms, the drains, and the opening and closing mechanisms. These are very important parts, and any report that is made, whether it is by a surveyor or by the ship staff, should actually be should include those items. And then we will see, and I put some inspection guidelines next to it, you can have a look to that, but that is actually what we have to inspect during a inspection. And now what do we see? That if we make that inspection, we see that on a population of 536 vessels, which is where I made my statistic from, and which goes over 1.5 years of our cargo worthiness inspections. So on 536 vessels, we have 2,831 issues or problems on the main key parts. That means an average of 5 to 6 key defects on every vessel. And the inspection pie next to it also illustrates the same things. So we can see that we have a lot of visual issues and problems when we make that visual inspection. And obviously, even if our compression on the packing rubber is okay at time of the test, if we see that key parts which are necessary to maintain that compression, to maintain tightness when the ship is at sea under relative movements, I mean, if those are not in good condition, not performing well, of course, we can also have wetting damage. From the moment that our bearing pads, locators, and so on are having too much clearance, that will actually compromise the design compression of the packing rubber, and that would lead to premature opening of the sealing during the dynamic conditions when the ship is at sea, and of course, then we get water ingress. So I'm showing you here a few defects which you will not see during an ultrasonic test, but only during the visual inspection afterwards. I mean, small insert repairs and expansion foam, weakened structure, cracks in the hatch cover beams, worn out bearing pads, improperly repaired bearing pads, damaged packing rubbers, silicone applied on the compression bar in an attempt to restore compression, which doesn't work, use of expansion foam, damaged securing arrangements, cleats here with rubber washer broken, banana-shaped cross wedges, shim plates in between locators which are excessively worn out, improperly positioned quick acting cleats. So we now come to the wrap-up of our presentation, and we know that weather tightness is not the same as passing an ultrasonic test in port. It is more. We want to know that apart from having compression on a packing rubber in port, we are going to maintain that compression when the ship is at sea, and we're going to use different parts, key parts, to achieve that. So weather tightness can only be achieved when all panel parts are in order, when ultrasounds gives us good results, and when a visual inspection that gives us info on the key parts is also satisfactory. And as you know, visual inspection key parts is millimeter work, and we have the hatch manual to provide us with facts and figures. Nothing like satisfactory in good working condition. No, we have to report in millimeters. That gives us unbiased evidence that things are okay or not. To measure is to know. And the visual inspection and also US testing requires training. Whether it is from the ship's crew or from the surveyors, I mean, that is what you need. So what do we see? I have listed for you some common mistakes with regards to weather tightness, things that we often see and which have a direct impact on weather tightness, like replacement of the rubber without fixing the bearing pads, use of backing strips, using mixed and old rubber together, the use of small pieces to fill up small gaps, and no or not sufficient painting of the retaining channel. We also have mechanical issues. People are not attentive when hatch covers are opened and closed. We ignore sounds during operation. There is no greasing or a greasing plan, and onboard repairs being made instead of onshore repairs, if necessary, by specialist personnel. And from a hydraulic point of view, we still see that filters are being cleaned instead of being changed or washed. Closing covers without using the pumps, changing of pipes without flushing them. Hydraulic oil needs to be clean, right? I mean, small particles at the pressure of 250 bar is like a shotgun. It's going to ruin everything. Not checking the valve positions during the voyage, and of course, ignoring small leaks. I mean, there is not something as a small leak. I mean, a small leak will become bigger. And if oil is leaking out, dirt can be sucked in, and then we come again to impurities in the oil. So if you want to ensure compliance with cargo worthiness compliance, First of all, see that you are okay from a technical point of view, and then try to improve the cargo worthiness issues by providing procedures, documents, and manuals for the people on board, and also for surveyors and superintendents. Carry out inspections and tests, keep records of that, and train the people. Also observe voyage seaworthiness, ensure that you have sufficient spare parts on board, that you carry out checks during the voyage, and of course, apply seamanship throughout. And most of all, be prepared, because if there is a claim, then you must be able to defend and to prove that you have done whatever is possible. And I have made a list with documents and procedures that you can prepare in case you should be struck by a cargo claim. And to conclude, I think, and I hope I made it clear, that certificates are not necessarily telling you everything. Fixing vessels on basis of technical criteria for seaworthiness can be risky, and it is not because your vessel has been fixed on those bases that your ship is cargo worthy. Remember that sailing is not the same as trading. Trading is your business model, not sailing. You know that seaworthiness is not the same as cargo worthiness, and inspections should be meaningful. That means they should give you, they should return facts and figures. No weasel words, no assumptions, no opinions, just the facts. That is going to defend you. Then, ultrasonic tests, they can be easily carried out and they are not expensive. So try to have from time to time a test carried out. It's going to help you in building up your records. Carry out tests, inspections, and proper maintenance on a regular basis because that is required by due diligence. Ensure that you have the necessary procedures in your plant maintenance system and your safety management system. And finally, don't forget that good training and familiarization of the crew is going to prevent a lot of problems. And by this, I close my case and I wish you all a dry, a safe, and especially a profitable voyage. So, John, back to you.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Walter. Thank you very much. Unless there's any burning and pressing questions, which you can, if you think of anything later on, because I understand we've run over a little bit, you can email to myself and I will pass on to Walter or to Claire. Then please feel free to do so. I very much appreciate your time. You'll understand what an important subject this is for us as a club and for you as members, so I'm glad that you were able to attend. The recording will be made available to everybody that signed up. So I'd just like to thank Walter and Claire for their help and for you all for attending. And thank you very much. I'll see you next time at the next event. Thank you very much.